It forces great powers to act in ruthless ways. What happened is that we produced one failure after another. Today, that line of argument is in complete tatters. I believe the United States and Britain are complicit in that genocide. I make people angry on both sides.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. With me in the studio today is the world-renowned international relations Professor John Mearsheimer. In recent years, he has gone from being an esteemed member of the Academy to something of a renegade icon, saying politically unacceptable things about the war in Ukraine, Israel, potential standoffs in China, and the rest. With his permission, we're going to try and take advantage of his presence here in the studio to ask a big question. Is realism, the school of foreign policy that Professor Mearsheimer is world famous for, winning the argument? What does realism actually mean? You hear it bandied about quite a lot these days, but what does it actually mean, and how does it apply to China, to the Middle East conflicts, and to Ukraine? Most pressingly, are either of the candidates for president realists? Or are they both to some degree? So will we find out in 2 weeks' time that in some way we're all realists now? So at the end of this hour, what I want is that you, the audience, will be able to know to what extent you yourself find yourself a realist in your worldview, and to be able to use that term with confidence when arguing with friends or non-friends over dinner. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome back to UnHerd.
Glad to be here, Freddie.
This episode is sponsored by Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Lumen will tell you if you're burning mostly fat or carbs. Then, Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time, and Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. It can also track your cycle as well as the onset of menopause and adjust your recommendations to keep your metabolism healthy throughout the hormonal shifts, so you can keep up your energy and starve off cravings. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/unheard to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/unheard for 15% off your purchase.
So as I said there, we're hoping for a little bit of a tutorial during this session. I hope that's okay. Let's start with the big question. What is realism in international relations?
Realism is a theory of international politics. It's a theory about how the world works that says that states care more than anything else about the balance of power. This is not to say they don't have other interests. It's not to say that states sometimes can't behave in idealistic ways. But when push comes to shove, it's the balance of power that matters the most to states. And states want to make sure that they have lots of power and that their potential adversaries have as little power as possible. And the principal reason for this is because in the international system, there is no higher authority. There's no ultimate arbiter. There's no Leviathan that can come to the rescue of states if they get into trouble. If you are a state and you're weak and a more powerful state comes after you, you can't turn to a higher authority to rescue you because there is no higher authority. The system is not hierarchic. It's anarchic in the sense that it's flat. And in a world like that, you have to take care of yourself. It's what we call in international relations lingo, it's a self-help world. And what you want to do in that self-help world is be as powerful as possible, because if you're really powerful, it's highly unlikely that anyone will attack you. Now, what this means in terms of liberal values, in terms of idealism, is that there are going to be cases where an idealistic policy lines up with a realist policy. Defeating Adolf Hitler in World War II makes sense from a strategic point of view, from a realist point of view. There's no question about that. The United States does not want Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich to dominate Europe for good realist reasons. At the same reason, it makes perfect sense from a liberal point of view or from an idealistic point of view to want to defeat Adolf Hitler for reasons I don't have to explain to you. So in that case, right, the two approaches go together. The question is, what happens when the arrows point in different directions? And realism calls for pursuing a ruthless foreign policy, and liberalism does not. Which of the two approaches wins out? And the answer from a realist point of view is that realism would dominate. And the reason is because realism is really all about survival. Realism is predicated on the assumption that survival is the highest goal that a state can have. And therefore, if survival is the highest goal, that means realism will trump idealistic logic. And by the way, Freddie, it will also trump economic logic if the two are in conflict. And just to give you a good example that highlights this, that really I think illustrates what realism is all about. Once China becomes a great power, we're talking roughly 2017, and it is seen by the United States as a peer competitor. The United States has a vested interest in making sure that it has much more power than China has. The United States wants to check the growth of China as a great power and accelerate its own growth so that the power gap between the two countries is as great as possible in favor of the Americans. But what this means is that the United States is going to have to pursue economic policies that are going to hurt the United States economically. A lot of people say to me, John, if we get tough with the Chinese, as we are now doing economically, it's going to damage the United States. It's going to hurt the American economy. It's going to slow down American economic growth. My response to that is, that's true. But that's the price you have to pay to make sure that you can contain China. So you see the economic arrow and the realist arrow are pointing in opposite directions.
So is it an amoral school? Is it that you are observing the way the world actually works and that there is merit in being truthful and realistic in observing those dynamics? Or do realists actually think there is moral value in survival and your first duty is to your own citizens and therefore it is kind of morally acceptable to pursue self-interest ruthlessly?
I would make the argument that it is an amoral, and very important to emphasize, I'm not saying immoral. It is an amoral theory. And we all have moral compasses in our head, and those moral compasses influence how we think about the world just the way realism does. And as I said, when they're in conflict, the realist compass, so to speak, dominates the moral compass. But realism by itself, in my opinion, is an amoral theory. Now, some people argue that it's not, and you were going down this road, which is not to say you believe this, but one could argue that survival is the highest goal of a state, and it is a virtuous or morally correct goal. And therefore, anything you do to enhance your survival is morally correct. I think if you make that argument, a great power can go out and behave in the most incredibly ruthless ways, and you can defend it as morally correct because it is facilitating that great power's survival. And I think if you go down that road, then it's hard to distinguish moral behavior from immoral behavior or ethical from unethical behavior. And I think that's kind of not the way to go.
So it's more a theory of the way the world actually works than any kind of hope of the way the world should work.
Well, it is the way the world works. And my argument is reflected in my most important book, where I lay out my realist theory. It's called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I think this is a tragic situation. I think the structure of the international system forces states, forces great powers especially, whether it's the United States, Germany, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, Russia. It forces great powers to act in ruthless ways. They have no choice, because in a world where there is no higher authority and another state may attack you, you have a vested interest, a profound interest in making sure you're powerful. And sometimes that requires doing ruthless things. And I think this is a tragic situation.
So if those people who started listening are still with us and it hasn't got too theoretical for them, I'm guessing a lot of people might be thinking, I guess maybe I'm a little bit of a realist. A lot of people were very disappointed by the misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, that whole sense of kind of liberal interventionism, this fantasy that we were going to impose democracy all around the world. That was a sort of unrealistic worldview and doesn't feel very popular anymore. And a lot of people are also pretty skeptical about overarching international institutions, such as the UN, having much influence these days. So if you're listening to this and feeling, this is beginning to align with my worldview, do you think those kinds of issues are likely to make you a realist with a small r, at least, a civilian realist?
Yeah, I think you're right. What happened here, in my opinion, Freddie, is that when the Cold War ended, and then when the Soviet Union collapses in December of 2001, we move into what is usually called the unipolar moment. And that means there's only one great power on the planet, and that's the United States of America, which is incredibly powerful. And in a very important way, realism gets put in the back closet or gets put on the back burner because there's no more great power competition. The United States does not have to worry about the balance of power because it's so incredibly powerful. So what the United States does during the unipolar moment, because it's a thoroughly liberal state, is it pursues a liberal foreign policy. It's, in the first time in its history, free to put aside realist concerns and behave in a very liberal way. And of course, the British, or Britain, which is another thoroughly liberal country, becomes part of a tag team with the United States, and the British and the Americans run around the world trying to spread liberal values, sometimes at the end of a rifle barrel. And what happened is that we produced one failure after another. This turned out to be a disastrous foreign policy. So what happens in 2017 with the coming of multipolarity, remember, in about 2017, you move from a unipolar world to a realist world. What roughly happens in 2017 is that realism is back for the United States because we're now in a multipolar world. There are great powers out there, China and Russia, to be specific. That's number one. But number two, what happens is that people understand that a liberal foreign policy, what I like to call liberal hegemony, our policy from roughly 2001 to 2017, has been, I think it's fair to say, a colossal failure. So people are much more sympathetic to realism starting in roughly 2017, moving forward, than they were during the unipolar moment. And of course, most people, and this includes people like you, grew up, came of age in the unipolar moment. Mm-hmm. So realism was something that was easy to be critical of, to dismiss during the unipolar moment. And most people in the liberal West were feeling really good about what liberalism could do. It was the Frank Fukuyama view of the world. What Frank said when the Cold War ended is that the future is liberalism. We liberals have the wind at our back, and what's going to happen is the world is going to become increasingly liberal. By 2017, that line of argument was not looking good. And today, that line of argument is in complete tatters. And when liberalism fails like that, and when you have two other great powers in the system, China and Russia, realism is going to make a comeback. And that's what we see happening here. So people are more sympathetic to realism for sure than they were in, let's say, 2000 or 2010.
Let's try and get specific with some of this, because so far it might seem quite an uncontroversial set of statements that you've made. I think most people would sign up to the failures of that kind of liberal way of thinking during those years. But in recent concrete examples, what you've been saying has been very controversial. A lot of people have been upset by it. They think it's inappropriate. So there is still a lot of energy in the idealistic or non-realistic worldview. Let's do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and people can feel if they agree with you when we get specific. Starting, if we could, with China, because I know you have most recently been there. You just came back from a trip earlier this month, is that right?
I did, yes.
So I'm guessing your head is full of thoughts about China. On this example, you take a different view to other people who you've maybe agreed with on other areas such as Ukraine and Israel, and you think it would be in America's interests to have really quite an aggressive vantage point or aggressive posture towards China to prevent its increase in power, to prevent it becoming the hegemon. Talk us through that. What would that actually look like?
Well, let me just start by saying that in the early 2000s, in 2001 in particular, when I published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and China was not a great power, it was a good 15 plus years away from that, I made the argument that China could not rise peacefully. And the United States, of course, was pursuing a policy of engagement toward China, which was designed to help China grow economically. And my argument at the time was that if China grew economically, it would translate that economic might into military might, and it would try to dominate Asia, East Asia, the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And the United States, of course, would go to great lengths to try to contain China. Hardly anyone agreed with me in the West. And when I went to China, there were a few people who thought there was a real danger that that would happen, but most people in China thought that it could rise peacefully. So I was a real outlier. I think what's happened since then proves that I was basically right, that you were going to get an intense security competition once China began to grow economically. And again, it gets back to the basic logic that I laid out to you at the start of the show, which is to say that the best way to survive for China in the international system is to be especially powerful. And if you're weak, you suffer what the Chinese suffered between the late 1840s and late 1940s. They call it the century of national humiliation. You never want to be weak in international politics because the other great powers in the system will take advantage of you. So what we see happening today in East Asia is that, number one, China is growing more and more powerful. It's translating that economic might into military might. And it's beginning to talk about dominating Asia. Right? And not only dominating Asia, they're building a blue water navy to project power all over the world. They are in a very important way following in the footsteps of the United States. Now, what is the United States and most of China's neighbors doing? They're very scared. They do not want China to dominate Asia. The United States does not want a peer regional hegemon. So what we're doing, to get to the heart and soul of your question, is we're pursuing a containment strategy against China, right? We're trying to contain China's growth to make sure it doesn't dominate Asia. And that containment strategy has two strands to it, right? One is a military strand and the other is an economic strand. The military strand is a lot like what happened in the Cold War. The United States is creating an alliance structure in East Asia that is designed to work with countries like Japan, the Philippines, and so forth and so on, to contain Chinese military power, to make sure China doesn't militarily dominate the region, much the way we worked to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Eurasia in the Cold War. That's strand number one. The other strand is an economic strand, and it has to do with cutting-edge technologies. The United States lives in mortal fear that China, because it has all of this terribly impressive human capital, is going to be able to dominate the United States when it comes to developing cutting-edge technologies. And that matters greatly for producing wealth, number one. And number two, it matters greatly for the military weaponry that you develop. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we win the race to develop sophisticated new technologies over time. So you see this military competition, which is all about containment, and you see this economic competition that is all about cutting-edge technologies that's all designed to contain China and allow the United States to remain the only regional hegemon on the planet.
But is that a good strategy? Because you're roughly describing what the United States government is currently trying to do. Are you saying that that's the right approach? Because there will be people watching who think this is more getting towards warmongering. This is all being driven by people who want big defense contracts and military spending and so on, and might be very worried about that and feel like we should be stepping back from competing in Asia and it's not even anywhere near us and we should leave it alone. But are you saying that's wrong and that the US should be pursuing this quite aggressive containment strategy?
I am saying it's wrong, that I think if China dominated Asia and had a blue water navy that had significant power projection capability all around the world, that would not be good for the United States. And I think we have a deep-seated interest in containing China. I think this is a tragic situation. I'm not enthusiastic about it all. I've been to China many times. I love going to China. I love the Chinese people. And in fact, I'm more at home intellectually in China than I am in the West, because the Chinese are basically realists, whereas in the West, people are instinctively liberal, and they instinctively don't like realism because it's such a pessimistic way of thinking about the world. So
did you say all this in China in recent weeks?
Oh, sure.
And you felt comfortable doing that?
Oh, sure.
You're not going to...
I didn't say it this time, but in past years when I've gone to China, I've often started my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people. I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I feel like I'm a fish out of water culturally, when I'm in China. But intellectually, the Chinese are my kind of people. They're realists, very interested in theory. I've never gone to any country where people are more interested in international relations theory and talking about the big issues.
But did you say to them that you think it's right that the U.S. is containing them?
Oh, yes.
And they feel, how do they respond to that?
Well, let me make it clear. I also say to the Chinese, I think they should try to dominate Asia. I say if I was the national security advisor in Beijing, I would want to dominate Asia. One of my principal goals would be to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, push the Americans out beyond the second island chain, and get the Americans out of East Asia. And then I do everything I can to maximize the power gap between China and Japan, China and India, and so forth and so on.
This is going to make some people a bit uncomfortable if they are now not exactly an enemy, but a non-friendly power at this point. To have an esteemed American professor going and giving them tips on how better to expel the Americans from their sphere of influence, a lot of Americans might be a bit uncomfortable hearing that.
They may, but I've been saying this for a long time, and I don't think, to be honest, the Chinese need me to tell them that this is what they should do, any more than the Americans needed me after 1783 to tell them what to do. My argument is the structure tells states basically what to do, and the Chinese long ago figured out that you want to be the most powerful state in Asia. But at the same time, I believe the United States should go to great lengths to check China. Now, the Chinese actually, I believe, like me very much, in good part because I tell them that the United States is a ruthless great power. And I do believe the United States is a ruthless great power. I do believe the United States is deeply committed to checking their rise. And the Chinese will say that most Americans who come through say the United States is a benign great power, that the United States and China can get along, but you, John, come in and tell the truth. You admit that the United States, your country, is a ruthless great power, to which my response is that's correct, because great powers are ruthless by definition. And the fact that great powers are ruthless is why you have to go to such great lengths to make sure your great power, the state that you live in, is very powerful. Because if you live in a great power that's weak, other powers will prey on you.
So if you're observing this potential future clash where it is in China's interests to dominate East Asia and it is in America's interest to prevent that happening, who do you expect to win that clash?
I believe that the United States will succeed in preventing China from dominating East Asia and becoming a peer regional hegemon. So I think that's true.
How will they achieve that?
The United States is remarkably powerful. It has lots of nuclear weapons, and it has a good number of allies in East Asia who will help the United States in that endeavor.
Up to and including war? For example, Taiwan is the most talked about flashpoint. Do you think it will come to actual conflict? And you think the US will prevail in that conflict?
Well, I think this is the key issue, Freddie. That's what concerns me. It's not so much who wins in the end, because I think that's far off, and I'll be long gone from the planet by the time that one is decided, in all likelihood. I think the much more interesting question is the one you raise, which is how likely it is that we'll have a war. And you want to remember, when you talk about a war between the United States and China, you're talking about a war between two nuclear-armed great powers, and the potential for escalation is always there, and we could, end up incinerating each other. So this is really serious business. And I think the key question moving forward is whether this will evolve the way the Cold War evolved. During the Cold War, we had a number of major crises, various crises over Berlin, and most importantly, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But thankfully, in all those crises in the Cold War, cooler heads prevailed, and we did not have a shooting war. And I just hope that moving forward, that is the case with regard to the United States and China. But my point is that this security competition is already present. And it's in the South China Sea, not so much over Taiwan these days, where you can see the two sides maneuvering with each other and where there's real potential for conflict, I think. And I just hope that if we have a major crisis somewhere down the road, that cooler heads will prevail on both sides.
So if a Chinese senior military person was sitting in one of your lectures in China in recent weeks and felt inspired that, yes, John Mearsheimer is right, we need to push ahead with making sure that we get regional domination. We're going to take a risk. We're going to have an actual standoff with the US in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. Would you support the US fighting back with weapons, with guns, with bombs to push that back and allow a real conflict to take place?
Yeah, I would support it. I mean, the key issue here is Taiwan. And the question is, will the United States fight and die to defend Taiwan if the Chinese were to invade Taiwan? And I think the answer is yes. I think that we would fight and die to defend Taiwan. I think the Japanese would be with us as well. I hope it doesn't come to that for sure, but I think it is important for the United States to make sure that China does not acquire Taiwan.
And do you think young Americans will enlist to go all the way to Taiwan in such a scenario, to fight and die to protect it? Or do you feel like among the civilian population, there is no longer appetite to take part in those kind of faraway foreign adventures?
Well, I think that should a war break out, let's say, China tries to invade Taiwan, the United States will use its existing military forces to enter the fight, right? So we will be in the fight. And I think the question that you're asking is whether or not we'll have to quit the fight because the American public will say, we're not going to fight this war. I think that is, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, extremely unlikely to happen because the government, the U.S. government, will go to great lengths to manipulate the discourse on what is going on in ways that present China as a mortal threat, and therefore give the American public powerful incentives to support the war, to include, participating in the fighting.
Final question on China before we move on our little global tour of great threats. Do you think there's a meaningful difference between a President Harris and a President Trump as regards China and how the US would respond to that kind of aggression? Or do you think the differences are exaggerated and it might be much the same?
I think there's not much difference. I think where there is real differences on Ukraine. But I think with regard to China, you want to remember the president who abandoned engagement with China and moved explicitly to a containment strategy was Donald Trump. Remember, my argument was that it was roughly around 2017 when China became a great power and Russia was resurrected from the dead, and it too became a great power. Trump was the one who explicitly abandoned engagement, which was designed to help China grow economically and to get along with China. And he pursued a containment strategy. And then when Joe Biden became president, he followed in Trump's footsteps. So I think Trump will continue to pursue containment. I think the only meaningful difference between Trump and Harris or Trump and Biden is how Trump deals with allies compared to how Biden has dealt with allies and how Harris is likely to deal with allies. I think Trump tends to be much too rough with allies. He tends to want to slap them around, whereas I think both Biden and Harris are much more interested in working with the allies in a cooperative way. But in terms of basic policy towards China, I just don't see any difference between Harris and Trump.
Let's move closer to where we are now and talk a little bit about the Middle East, because that is obviously one of the other main areas of concern. There's war currently, and there's a big danger that it might escalate in different directions. What is the kind of realist approach to the conflict that Israel is currently engaged in? I remember we had a conversation about this before, where I was perhaps naively arguing that what Israel is doing, i.e. actually taking aggressive steps into neighboring countries to defend its security as it perceives it, neighboring countries or territories in the case of Gaza, that seemed kind of realistic. And I remember you saying that was to misunderstand realism. So explain to our viewers and listeners, what is the realist take on the Israel conflict?
Well, there's sort of two ways we could cut into this issue. One is to talk about what is a realist American foreign policy, and then focus instead on Israel and say, is Israel's behavior realist in nature?
Let's start with that second question. Do you think Israel is behaving like a realist would advise them to do?
I'm not sure how to answer that. The problem, as I believe I said to you before, is that the taproot of the conflict here is between the Palestinians and Israel, right? And if you look at Israel and what's happening with regard to Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's all an outgrowth of what's happening in Gaza with regard to Israel and Hamas. The only reason that Hezbollah is firing rockets and missiles into Israel is to support Hamas in Gaza. Iran is a different matter. Realism does not have much to say about Israel's conflict with the Palestinians. Realism, as I understand it, because it doesn't deal with interstate relations. It's a domestic problem. There is this entity called Greater Israel. Greater Israel includes Israel, the Israel that was created in 1948 and existed until 1967, plus the two territories, Gaza and the West Bank, that it acquired in the 1967 war. So when you talk about Israel today, you're talking about Greater Israel. Israel basically owns Gaza and it owns the West Bank. You know, we refer to them as the occupied territories, but as far as the Israelis are concerned, they're part of a Greater Israel. And what's taking place inside Gaza today and taking place on the West Bank is basically a civil war between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And I don't think realist theory, as I understand it, has much to say about it. If you want to talk about what's realistic with a little r, I think the Israelis have been remarkably foolish over time not to create a Palestinian state, that it was in Israel's interest to give the Palestinians some form of sovereignty, some sense of a viable state, so that the two peoples could live side by side. I think creating a greater Israel, which is effectively an apartheid state, where the Palestinians are subjugated, dominated by the Israelis, is not in Israel's interest, because you're going to get what happened on October 7th, just as you had a first intifada and a second intifada before that. So from a realist point of view with a little r, I think that what the Israelis are doing is not smart. And I think it is going to do enormous damage to the country over time. Iran, though, is a different issue. Israel and Iran are independent countries in the region. And the Israelis have a deep-seated interest in, number one, making sure Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons, and number two, making sure Iran does not become a regional hegemon. If you look at the latent power that Iran has, latent power meaning population size and wealth, Iran has the potential to dominate the region. And the Israelis don't want that. And of course, they don't want them to have nuclear weapons. So that's a case where realism kicks in. I would argue that the policies that the Israelis have pursued vis-a-vis the Iranians is not smart from a realist with a capital R point of view. I think, for example, pulling out of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that the great powers and the European states had fashioned with Iran was foolish. I think the Israelis made a major mistake there.
My guess is that some people listening will be a bit surprised, because from how you described realism at the start, which was a sort of clear-eyed vision of states acting in their own interests, that's just the way the world is, let's not pretend otherwise. Sometimes they need to take hostile action in order to defend themselves and protect themselves. It feels like Israel is the kind of perfect example of that. And you could say they're being pretty effective at it. And the disaster that many people have predicted for Israel, this was going to lead to an incursion from Hezbollah in the north. This was all part of a sort of four-dimensional chess plan that was going to conclude with a real crisis for Israel, hasn't happened. Israel currently seems like it is an effective military player. What would you say to people who said that?
I think it's just dead wrong. And I think it reflects the fact that the Western media's coverage of Israel is so out of touch with reality that people like you can make those kinds of arguments. Let's talk about the three conflicts. The one in Gaza, the conflict with Hezbollah, and the conflict against Iran. Israel has three goals in Gaza. One was to decisively defeat Hamas, two was to get the hostages back, and three, which is unstated, was to ethnically cleanse Gaza. The Israelis are bent on cleansing Gaza and the West Bank. They have not decisively defeated Hamas. They're not going to decisively defeat Hamas. They have not gotten the hostages back, and they have not ethnically cleansed Gaza. And furthermore, they're stuck in Gaza. You remember they got out of Gaza, I think it was in 2005 or 2006. They left Gaza because it was a hornet's nest. Well, they're back in there, and they've not defeated Hamas. With regard to Hezbollah, they first tried to decapitate Hezbollah. They were successful, but they've been decapitating leaders in the Middle East for years now. It doesn't produce victory. Then when decapitation failed, they went and started killing huge numbers of civilians in southern Beirut and in southern Lebanon. That didn't work. And then they invaded on the ground on roughly October 1st. They went in. And that hasn't worked. They're getting clobbered in southern Lebanon. For anybody who, follows the internet, reports on this carefully, they're getting clobbered. And remember, the reason that they tried decapitation, then they tried to kill large numbers of Lebanese, and here we're talking mainly about Hezbollah, and the reason they invaded was to stop the rocket fire into northern Israel. They've not stopped the rocket fire. They've not succeeded against Hezbollah, and they're not going to succeed against Hezbollah. I mean, at some point, some negotiated settlement may be worked out. Who knows? But the idea that their military strategy has worked, it hasn't worked against Hezbollah, and it hasn't worked against Hamas. And against Iran, the Iranians are still capable of retaliating against Israel, sending large numbers of ballistic missiles into Israel.
But were the strikes on Iran not quite successful in that Iran seems to have retreated from further hostile rhetoric since then? It seems to have contained their aggression somewhat, at least in the short term?
No, I mean, first of all, the evidence is now coming out that the attacks were not successful. There were supposed to be 3 waves of attacks. The first wave did the corridor cutting. The first wave involved aircraft carrying missiles that were designed to destroy the radars and the missiles that the Iranians had on the ground. And then the second wave and the third raid would follow behind, go into Iran, and attack the targets. The first wave of Israeli attacks against the air defense radars and the air defense missiles was aborted. It didn't work. And the second wave and the third wave, as best we can tell, never entered Iranian airspace. Remarkably little damage was done to Iran. But the question...
I guess it's hard to know exactly.
It's hard to know exactly, but this is what the evidence that's now coming out says. But the point is, Freddie, even if they had gone in and done massive damage to Iran, what do you think the Iranians would have done? They would have retaliated against Israel. They have the missiles to do it.
Why have they not done that?
Because the Israelis, number one, didn't do massive damage on this most recent attack last Friday. Furthermore, who's to say that the Iranians won't retaliate? But the Israelis do not have escalation dominance over Iran. Just very important to understand this. In the old days, the Israelis had escalation dominance over almost all their adversaries. If you listen to the story that I was telling you about Hezbollah, the Israelis don't have escalation dominance over Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still firing rockets and missiles into Israel. And by the way, now the Houthis are also firing missiles into Israel.
What is so interesting is that your critique in this discussion of Israel is not a moral one, because we're discussing the realist framework, which, as you say, is an amoral way of looking at the world. It's that it's ineffective. You're basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're basically saying Israel would be entitled, in realist theory, to take these kinds of aggressive actions in order to defend its existence, to protect its sphere of influence. But the way they've been doing them have been ineffective. Is that a fair summary?
Well, look, you raised the issue of the effectiveness of military strategies that the Israelis are pursuing vis-a-vis their various adversaries. And that's what I addressed. We're not talking about the moral implications of what Israel is doing in Gaza. I think what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is a genocide. They are executing a genocide. I want to be very clear on that. And I think that is morally reprehensible. And it is a stain on Israel's reputation that will not go away for decades, if not centuries. And I want to be very clear. I believe the United States and Britain are complicit in that genocide. But we were not talking about the genocide. We were talking about the effectiveness of what Israel is doing. And what I'm telling you is the conventional wisdom in the West that Israel is on a roll, that Israel is in the driver's seat, is simply wrong. And if you look at what's happening in Gaza, you look at what's happening with regard to Hezbollah and Iran, right? Israel is in trouble. And I want to point out here that the key variable here is the coming of sophisticated missiles and rockets. When I was very young and used to study the Israeli-Arab conflicts, right, what we focused on in those days were army-to-army and air-to-air engagements. And the Israelis invariably defeated the Israelis invariably defeated the Arab armies, whether you're talking about 48, 56, 67, 73, those big wars. And it looked, up until October 7th, like the Israelis were really in the driver's seat, that they faced no serious threat. Then October 7th happened, and what became manifestly apparent to all sorts of people, including me, was that there was this really wicked rocket and missile threat against Israel that Israel had no way of dealing with. That's what I was saying to you before when I talked about the effectiveness of Israel's strategies vis-a-vis its various adversaries.
The Iron Dome is the most effective counter-rocket defense shield in the world,
is a myth.
Is it not?
The Iron Dome was penetrated in previous attacks. The first attack by the Iranians was on April 14th, and the second attack by the Iranians was on October 1st. And in both cases, they penetrated the Iron Dome. And by the way...
Very small proportion.
No, I don't think it was a very small proportion. I think it was close to 50% got through, if not more. And every time they come after Iron Dome, it's weaker because Iron Dome expends missiles. But the other point I would make to you, which is a very important point, is the Israelis can't use Iron Dome alone to defend themselves against the Iranians. The Americans are deeply involved. We just put at least one THAAD missile battery in Israel. We have all sorts of naval ships that are in the Eastern Med, off the Red Sea. We have tactical aircraft, we meaning the Americans, in the region that are helping the Israelis fend off these Iranian attacks, whether it's on April 14th or on October 1st or when another one comes. The Iron Dome itself doesn't work.
So what do you think, given everything you've said from your vantage point, what do you think an effective realist strategy by Israel would be, setting aside any moral concerns? If you were advising them much as you were advising the Chinese a few weeks ago, what would you advise them to do to maximize their strength and security?
Well, I think with regard to the problem with Hamas and the problem more generally with the Palestinians and with regard to the problem with Hezbollah, I have a realist strategy, not with a capital R, but with a little r, that has to deal with how Israel treats the Palestinians. And there I would advocate a two-state solution. But there's no two-state solution in sight. It's an impossible outcome at this point in time. And therefore, I think Israel is doomed to endless conflict with the Palestinians in its midst. And by the way, this is why the Israelis' principal goal in Gaza is ethnic cleansing. They don't say it loudly and clearly. There's plenty of evidence that that's what they're doing. But they want to cleanse Gaza, and they want to cleanse the West Bank. And they want to do that because they understand full well, as long as they have huge numbers of Palestinians in their midst, they're going to have a first intifada, second intifada, and another October 7th. And they don't want that.
And we could get into a whole series of arguments here around the nature of the Palestinian population in Israel and how different efforts they've had to secure different kinds of peaceful outcome. Let's avoid that because that could take the rest of our time out. A lot of people might have listened to the first section of this conversation about China, and let's say they were on the political right, let's say they were Republican-minded, perhaps fans of Elbridge Colby and the like, circle of Donald Trump, they would have pretty much been nodding their heads when listening to you on China. Listening to you on Israel, they would have been throwing up their hands in horror and saying, oh no, this guy is some kind of far left, activist. This is the opposite of what we want. Tell me about that interesting tension, how your views on China seem to roughly align with the political right, whilst your views on Israel seem to align with the political very much left.
Well, again, I think what you say is true, for sure. I'm not disputing that. But when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the conflict with Hezbollah, this is not in the realm of realism. Realism doesn't explain everything that happens in the world. This is basically a civil war. And what really matters here are ideologies like nationalism. And this is Palestinian nationalism up against Zionism, and Zionism is basically Jewish nationalism. And I have all sorts of views on these subjects.
I guess I'm more asking about what your experience is living in the US in this very heated political climate, where some of your views, publicly and cogently expressed, strongly accord with the political right, and others absolutely with the left of the Democratic Party. What's that like for you?
Well, what it means is that I make people angry on both sides. There's just no question about that. At this point in time, most of the discussion in the United States is about Ukraine and about Palestine, or Israel-Palestine. And there I have a whole set of individuals or people who I agree with, and we're sort of a group that is articulating a particular explanation for what's going on in those two conflicts.
So you have no political home?
And well, when those people hear me talk about China, they find my views to be wrong-headed, and they get angry at me. There's no question about that. I always tell people exactly what I think. I don't pull my punches. And again, this is not to say I'm right and others are wrong, but when I talk, you're getting a straight analysis of the situation, whether we're talking about Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, or China. And the really interesting question, Freddie, is how often am I right and how often am I wrong?
Well, that brings me nicely to the third area that we want to talk about. We haven't got too much time, and we've spoken about it before, so we'll be a little bit briefer here, but that is Ukraine. And on this area, on this central topic so important to us here in Europe, I would say that the things you were saying that were considered very, very controversial 2 or 2.5 years ago are now said by all sorts of people in the mainstream every day. The quote-unquote realist view of the Ukraine conflict that you have been one of the most famous proponents of, critical of the actions of the West, feeling like missteps were made all along the way, and that some kind of accommodation was going to need to be made with Russia. If you said that 2 years ago, you would have been branded a Putin apologist. It would have been considered outrageous. In fact, it happened to me. I said a milder version of that on a BBC television program, and suddenly I was, in the pay of Vladimir Putin. Whilst now I hear people all across the political spectrum, including both sides of the aisle in the US, saying things like negotiation is going to be necessary, peace will only come through diplomacy, Ukraine is never going to reconquer Crimea, all sorts of things that were considered taboo 2 years ago. Do you observe that? Do you feel like the world has caught up with you on Ukraine?
Somewhat. When we talk about the world, I like to distinguish between the West and the rest.
Western world, let's say.
The Western world has somewhat caught up. I think the key issue that has been on the front burner for a long time is who's principally responsible for causing the war. And there my argument that it was NATO expansion, bringing Ukraine into NATO, is accepted by more people in the West than was the case, let's say, 2 years ago, but still is not widely accepted in the West. It's widely accepted outside the West, right? But in the West, I think most people still think that Putin is the bad guy. And even though a negotiated settlement, some form of the diplomatic solution is necessary now, we have to keep in mind that he is a bad guy and that his invasion of Ukraine cannot be justified or explained in any reasonable way. So I don't feel like everybody completely agrees with me.
But the fact of some kind of negotiation being likely, perhaps necessary, now seems like a mainstream view.
Yes,
2 years ago that was not
true.
True.
There's no question about that. And I just think more and more people also understand that NATO expansion was the taproot of the problem. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg, when he was the head of NATO, said exactly that 2 times. I actually privileged those 2 quotes from him where he says basically what I've been saying for a long time, that NATO expansion is the taproot of the problem. And by the way, Freddie, this is a realist argument, right? My argument against NATO expansion was that the Russians would view it as an existential threat, and it would lead them to pursue a policy that involved destroying Ukraine to prevent it from becoming part of Ukraine. That was very much a realist argument. But people in the West rejected that realist argument, and they were making more liberal arguments about why NATO expansion was justified. The argument that Ukraine has a right to join NATO. This is very much a liberal argument. And the argument that people like Mike McFaul made that NATO expansion was not about containing Russia. It was all about spreading the liberal order from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. Those kinds of arguments were not realist arguments, and they were the competitors to my argument.
So do you feel like, if we're looking ahead to the presidential election in less than 2 weeks' time, do you think that to some degree both candidates are now realist on Ukraine? How would you characterize the difference or similarity facing the US on that topic?
Well, I would just say at a very general level, I think that Ukraine is the one foreign policy issue where Harris and Trump are furthest apart. I think with regard to East Asia, the China threat, with regard to the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, there's not a lot of daylight between the two of them. But I think on Ukraine there is. I think that Trump has long wanted to, number one, have good relations with Russia and Putin in particular. Number two, shut down the Ukraine war. And number three, reduce America's commitment to Europe, if not end NATO. I think these are instinctively the things that Trump wants to do. Whether he can do them is another matter. I think Harris, on the other hand, will continue, if she's elected, the Biden policy of doing everything possible to continue to support Ukraine, to remain deeply antagonistic toward both Putin and Russia, and to certainly continue the alliance. So I think there's a fundamental difference in terms of what their intentions are.
So you don't see movement there? Because I would say even on the Democratic side, there's been a change in rhetoric. There have been more words of caution about escalatory threats, some kind of restraint on the use of some of the longer-range missiles and so on, and a general shift in the discourse with allowing a greater possibility of negotiation. That seems to have happened even on the Democratic side.
Well, allowing for negotiations, there's no question. It's because the Russians are winning on the battlefield. We're being forced to accept the fact that some sort of deal may have to be cut to put an end to this. But in terms of...
But that will probably happen whether it's President Harris or President Trump.
I think that's correct, yeah.
So in that sense, the difference is maybe more one of intention than one of outcome, because we may end up with some kind of deal within the next couple of years, whoever wins.
Yeah. I would just say, I don't think you're going to get a meaningful peace agreement between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other side, no matter who is president. It's not going to happen. Relations are so thoroughly poisoned between both sides now that I think the best we can hope for is a frozen conflict, which will be very dangerous. But I don't see a negotiated settlement. The problem is that Putin will drive a very hard bargain. He will really want a lot, and it will be almost impossible for the West, whether Trump is in power or Harris is in power, to make all the concessions that he wants. This is why I think that this crisis between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other will continue for the foreseeable future, and it will create a poisonous strategic environment in Europe. I think the decision that was made in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO, which precipitated this crisis and this war, was one of the most catastrophic decisions made in modern history by a great power. And I blame the United States mainly here. Because you want to remember, the Germans and the French were both adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Angela Merkel, who opposed it at that famous April 2008 NATO summit, said that she understood that Putin would interpret this as a declaration of war. She understood. But nevertheless, she went along with the Bush administration, and we are where we are. But the consequences of this are just disastrous.
So you don't believe that if Donald Trump wins, he will be able to make a deal? Because that's what he's been telling his supporters. And, that's what he supposedly likes to do. The art of the deal. Could he go to Vladimir Putin and say, here's your choice. I'm going to massively ramp up support for Ukraine and I'm going to make this my number one priority, or we can do a deal. And then go to Zelensky and say, I'm either going to withdraw all funding or you're going to come to a deal with Putin. Could he do that in the first weeks?
No. First of all, we can't do much more to help Ukraine. We don't have the weaponry. I mean, a lot of people argue now that we're not supporting Ukraine to the hilt. We're not giving them weaponry that we have on the shelf that we could easily give to them. This is not true at all. The European weapons inventories are barren because so much weaponry has been given to the Ukrainians. And we don't have the industrial base in the United States or the industrial base in Europe to produce, the artillery tubes, the artillery shells, and the tanks that the Ukrainians need. But furthermore, and this is, I think, the more important point, Putin doesn't trust the West at all. He doesn't care whether Donald Trump is president or Kamala Harris is president. He's not going to trust them. You want to remember that Trump came into office in January 2017 saying that he was going to improve relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. That never happened. And when he left office, relations were terrible. He's the one who decided that the United States will arm the Ukrainians. You want to understand that. It was Donald Trump who decided that the United States, this was in December 2017, that we'd arm the Ukrainians. Putin's not going to trust Trump. And furthermore, even if he did trust Trump, he understands full well Trump is history in 4 years. We're assuming, of course, that he gets reelected or elected. Putin is going to drive a hard bargain. He's going to take a lot of Ukrainian territory, and he's going to go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is not in NATO, that it is a genuinely neutral state, and that if the West doesn't cooperate, he'll make sure that it's a dysfunctional rump state. So
there is no strategy for the West at this point that can have a happy outcome.
No,
from the way you see it.
No. I think we're basically doomed here. I think
this is the tragedy of, as you call it, the tragedy of great power politics.
No, this is not the tragedy of great power politics. This is the tragedy that's created by remarkably foolish policymaking by the West in 2008 and moving forward. And the United States is principally responsible. The decision to expand NATO into Ukraine was a colossal error. And it should have been clear to us after 2008, certainly by 2014 when the crisis broke out. Remember, we make the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO in April 2008. The crisis doesn't break out until 2014. And of course, the war breaks out 8 years later in 2022. Okay? But after 2008, at every point along the road, we, meaning the West, doubles down. And it's mainly because of the Americans. And we're now at a point where it's almost impossible, in my mind, I hope I'm wrong here, to see how we can come up with some sort of negotiated settlement that creates a peaceful outcome for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the West. And we can go back to having good relations or quasi-good relations with or between Russia and the West. I think those days are long gone.
In less than 2 weeks' time, we will be waking up to, unless the result is very delayed and unclear at that point, most likely there will be a result on the 6th of November. You've said that you are politically homeless or don't feel at home with either party especially. Thinking purely in your scholarly realist way. Which of those two options do you feel would be more likely to maximize the security and strength of the United States internationally?
I don't think it matters. I think that the United States will pretty much behave the same way in terms of foreign policy, whether you have Harris or Trump. I mean, I think that the structure of the system just doesn't leave us much choice, and the power of the deep state in the United States will make it virtually impossible for Trump to pursue a bold foreign policy over Ukraine. So I just don't think it matters very much at all.
It's a bleak note to end on, Professor Mearsheimer, but I always notice when we have these conversations how you remain such a sunshiny and optimistic person despite having this really quite bleak worldview. How do you manage that?
Well, I think in terms of interpersonal relations, I have a very bright view of the world. I thoroughly enjoy being here talking to you, but there's no question, as you point out, that the substance of our discussion is thoroughly depressing. It really is depressing to think where we are today. If you go back to when the Cold War ended, what the world looked like in 1990, and certainly in 1992, the year after the Soviet Union collapsed, it really looked like we were in the catbird seat, and it was just sunshine and roses moving forward. And if you compare that world with the world that we're in today, it's thoroughly depressing. I mean, we haven't even talked about domestic politics inside the United States and domestic politics here in Europe, and...
That'll have to be for a follow-up episode after the election,
yes.
John. I'll come to Chicago and we'll thrash out the domestic scene.
Yes, I can guarantee you it'll be a gloomy conversation, although I will again enjoy talking to you.
As will I. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you for coming to UnHerd.
My pleasure, Freddie.
That was Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, an internationally renowned scholar from the realist school of international relations. We darted all the way around the world there in that discussion, but I hope there was a bit of a cohering thread, which is to try to understand realism, this way of thinking which has made Professor Mearsheimer so famous, and to try to apply it in those different scenarios. And I think what is so interesting and no doubt maddening to many people who follow Mearsheimer's thinking is that you can strongly agree with him about one of these theatres of conflict and equally passionately disagree with him about another. At the end of all that, whether you think of yourself as a realist is for you to work out, but I've really enjoyed exploring it, and as always with John Mearsheimer, a stimulating and interesting conversation. Thanks to him, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.